Welcome back to the Garden Podcast, where we cultivate our faith one verse at a time. Now you see a little tree here and a little snake here. The garden represents the order that God wants to bring to his people even today. And the snake is going to represent the chaos monster that is trying to go against God's plan. You're going to hear these themes all over this podcast when we read our Bible and when we cultivate our faith one verse at a time. Thanks for watching. Hey, welcome back to the Garden Podcast, where we cultivate our faith one verse at a time. I want to talk about Daniel 1 today, and we'll just read through it. And I preached on this Wednesday. I think it's a really interesting topic. Someone gave me the idea that the world we're living in today is the modern day Babylon. And we're just going to read through it and see how we as Christians exist in a world similar to Daniel's time. So I will read the first, let's read the first few verses here in Daniel 1. In the third year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and laid siege to it. Now this is verse 1 right off the bat. They knew this exile was coming. The Israelites did. They just didn't believe. Ezekiel, I think possibly Jeremiah, I think prophesied about it. I can't really remember. They knew this was coming. What commonly happens is that the people of Israel don't ever believe the prophets every time they tell them something. Also, if you like my new Bible timeline, I'm just now realizing I need to put maybe a picture out there. I'm trying to experiment because eventually I'm going to get back in my studio, but we moved our offices around and I need to set my office back up so I can start shooting in my office again. But this will do for right now. I know it doesn't look like a garden or anything, but eventually we'll get back to it. So if you read the Bible and for any amount of time, you know that Jeremiah really went through it. Ezekiel really went through it. Any of the prophets went through it because Israel never believed the word that they would get from the Lord. They were supposed to communicate what God wanted them to share. And so by the time they shared what needed to be said, the Israelites didn't believe them. So by the time you get to Daniel's timeline up here, I think it's 605. Well, I have it written right here. So let's see. 605 BC is right about 700. Right about here. You're going to have Daniel right here at 620 to 540 is what it says on this timeline. Give or take, I'm not sure. I got this at Mardell. But so Ezekiel, Daniel, and even Jeremiah are alive at the same time. And it looks like we barely miss Nahum. Zechariah comes a little bit later. But the first exile of Jews to Babylon is 605 BC. So Daniel is in that first group, and it looks like Ezekiel is too. Let's see, 605. So anyways, Daniel has to make some decisions right off the bat. And verse 2, the Lord handed King Jehoiakim of Judah over to him along with some of the vessels from the house of God. Nebuchadnezzar carried them to the land of Babylon, to the house of his God, and put the vessels in the treasury of his God. The king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the Israelites from the royal family and from the nobility. Young men without any physical defect, good-looking, suitable for instruction and all wisdom, knowledgeable, perceptive, and capable of serving in the king's palace. So the first thing that Nebuchadnezzar does is chooses a group of men, which Daniel is among that group, chooses a group of men to serve in his kingdom, serve in his palace. I'm going to move this just a little bit like that. Because he wants to start indoctrinating people. He wants to start indoctrinating a group of men that are going to help him because he's just growing his kingdom. But one of the common practices in Babylon, and I would think any kingdom trying to expand and take over, was to change their names too. So he would have taken their Hebrew Jewish names and made them into some kind of pagan names that pointed to Nebuchadnezzar's God. So let's skip down just a little bit. Among this group, there was Daniel and then Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And we grew up knowing them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But really, we should stick to using their Hebrew names because even though they get remembered as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and because of the fiery furnace story, really we should remember them by Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, because all three of their names mean something very specific that points to Jehovah, points to their God. And Daniel's name means something like that as well. And Nebuchadnezzar changes his name to Belshazzar, or Belteshazzar. And Baal, those first three letters, is basically talking about, translates to Marduk, which is Nebuchadnezzar's god. So it's very degrading that he would take them and change their names to basically disrespect them and their religion, and disrespect their names that would remind them of Yahweh. And so he has to indoctrinate people, though. It's just like Alexander the Great does it later on, where he's actually known to have the widest and fastest spread of hedonism. He's down here somewhere. Alexander the Great right here in 336 to 323 BC. And that's not a very long time to be alive. But he had a very quick spread, and so he had to set up these elaborate buildings, set up these elaborate statues, and spread hedonism all over the world, and that's another topic. So anytime you have a kingdom, famously Genghis Khan, and he might even actually be on this timeline, because this timeline has the biblical timeline, it has world history, and then it even has world history and then Middle East history, so it has like timelines on each section here. And I'm not going to take the time to look for Khan, but he might be on there. There might even be a picture of him. Now I'm kind of intrigued, now that I think about it. But anyways, he did the same thing. He ravaged villages, took over, and their kingdom, essentially. So, which makes me think, by the way, and I'm just going on a tangent here, because that's just what I do. Somebody else in the Bible that changes people's names, and that's Jesus. But when he does it, he's speaking your true identity over you. And he's not leading you to point to some other God. That's the difference. He changes Peter's name, which is like the rock. He changes, I think, James and John to the sons of thunder. Like, an awesome name. Name isn't technically changed by Jesus, but he changes his life, his trajectory. When Paul would have thought that he was already serving God, Jesus changed his entire life. So when Jesus speaks over you, even when it's convicting, listen to his voice. Listen to that conviction. Okay? If Jesus calls you by a different name than what you're used to, a perfect example, in the Old Testament, Jacob's name is changed to Israel, which means wrestles with God. Jacob took the time to establish God's blessing back over his life because he messed up in the very beginning of his life. And so he wrestles with God, and God changes his name to Israel. And so when God does it, you're a Christian, or not even, actually people in general, are made in God's image. And you need to step into your identity by accepting Christ and following him and being obedient to Jesus' kingdom. But when Nebuchadnezzar does it, he's changing your name to degrade you and call you by an identity that you were never supposed to have. So, in verse 8, Daniel 1:8, Daniel determined that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine he drank. So he asked permission from the chief eunuch not to defile himself. This is the part that I kind of to focus on, and I don't want to make this video too much longer, is that in a world of temptation, where it would have been easier just to eat what the king was eating and drink what the king was drinking, but he didn't want to defile himself. He wanted to stay true to his God. And we know that Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah do the same thing because they don't bow down to the statue and they get thrown into the fiery furnace and God saves them. So Daniel, I'll just read a little bit more, but Daniel decides not to eat the meat that the king would serve and not to drink the wine. And because any kind of meat back in the day would have been sacrificed to their God. At any point from this point forward, it was known that whatever God you serve, you sacrifice and give that meat to that God. And so he was not going to eat the meat sacrificed to a pagan god. Well, his chief eunuch says, or Nebuchadnezzar's eunuch says, continue in verse 9, I'm
himself with the king's food or drink the wine, so he asked permission from the chief eunuch not to defile himself. God had granted Daniel kindness and compassion from the chief eunuch. Yet he said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king. He's talking about Nebuchadnezzar, who assigned your food and drink. What if he sees your faces looking thinner than the other men your age? You would endanger my life with the king. So he's saying, what if you guys end up looking thinner than the others? Then Nebuchadnezzar is going to have a problem with me and endanger my life. So Daniel said to the guard whom the chief eunuch had assigned to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink, nothing else. Then examine our appearance and the appearance of the young men who are eating the king's food, and deal with your servants based on what you see. He agreed with them about this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, they looked better and healthier than all the young men who were eating the king's food. So the guard continued to remove their food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. Now, that's the difference, actually the similarity with today, is that it would have been really tempting and easier just for him to eat the king's food. We technically be sinning. If I were to do a deep dive, he thought he was sinning, then yes. He did not want to defile himself. So it might have just been easier to just fall in line and do what you're supposed to do. And he chose to make it more difficult and just eat vegetables. Like, many of us would do that. Like, we're suddenly to the White House and there's some elaborate dinner. But if there's a food in there or something that you wouldn't eat because it would disrespect God, just short, if it knew it was going to disrespect God, it would be easier to not cause a fuss and just go ahead and eat that to protect our own reputation. But what does your reputation matter when it comes down to it? So my today is that we live in a world in our kids and teenagers are growing up in today. They live in a world that no longer sees America, from America as a Christian nation anymore. We need to, not ourselves where we're trying to raise kids in a Christian nation. We need to raise them in a modern day Babylon where we don't do what the world is doing just because it's easier. They only eat vegetables when it would have just been easier to not cause a scene or anything. But God was faithful to them, because they wanted to still honor God in the middle of Babylon. So that's my only point, is we today need to honor God in the middle of our modern day Babylon. See, they knew this exile was coming, but God told them to go ahead and have families, get married, buy a house in the middle of Babylon. That doesn't mean we need to act like the world. That doesn't mean they're supposed to act like Babylon. But he's like, now you're going to serve me in the middle of exile. Is it going to be 10 times harder? Yes. And so it's our modern world is like that today. The just perspective here in America, that's what it's like today, is the church seems to be more challenged every single day and seems to be more persecuted every single day. And it may not look that bad yet, but I feel like we're in the early stages where, maybe a generation or 20, 30 years from now, people will be like the first, like Daniel. They're to make very obvious to not, take mark of the beast, as people like to call it. And this is what the Bible calls it. But taking on the mark of the beast means you're following ways of the world and following the devil, or you take the mark of Jesus, take his covenant and follow him. Not just believe in him and accept his ways and accept him for who he is, but to follow him in a world that would say, no, you need to fall in line with Babylon. But we need to choose that we're going to follow Jesus. Okay? So whatever it looks like for you, it may be a problem with food or anything like that. It may be something else. But if the Lord is convicting you, we need to be willing to step up for the kingdom of God, even in the middle of Babylon, even in the middle of our post-Christian world, where kids are no longer, not even kids, but just generally Christians are not respected like they used to be. We have freedom of religion in America, but there is a lack of respect for Christians now. I would say even up until the early 2000s, there was still a general respect for Christians in this world, for Christians in America especially. But these days, I think our teenagers are among the first
maybe even second generation, that are growing up in a post-Christian world where things are starting to move, where people are discovering other religions, they're discovering occult practices, aspect is becoming popular again, but they're seeking other avenues of spirituality. They're not necessarily following Christianity. So if the world is taking a step in the direction of disrespecting Christianity, I wonder what the next generation is going to be like. Now, in saying all this, we shouldn't be surprised as Christians. Okay, if you read your word, if you stay in it, if you pray, then know that our world is going in a direction to where Jesus is planning on coming back. He's going to need to come back one day. In the first place is to come back and establish his kingdom once and for all. But until then, we need to be followers of the way, even in the middle of Babylon.